Every year, Bill and Melinda Gates release a letter talking about their philanthropic efforts. This year, the letter is all about the future, specifically how technology will dramatically change the lives of the poor in just the next 15 years. That's exactly the sort of thing we think about at The Verge, so we asked Bill Gates if he would be our guest editor in February as we explore the 4 areas he thinks will undergo the most change. As you might have guessed, Bill agreed, and I spent the afternoon with him talking about his vision for the next 15 years. He also talked a little smack about Bitcoin.
It's kind of a special year because the foundation's now 15 years old, and also this year we have the UN looking at the Millennium Development Goals, which were the world's progress from 1990 to 2015, and adopting the next 15 years of goals. So what can we get done by 2030? So we pick health, education, farming, and banking and say, we think some very dramatic things can happen. In fact, we go as far as to say we bet that life for the poorest will improve more in this 15-year period than it ever has before.
So let's get right into the 4 areas. I want to start with health because I think that is where you're making both a set of big bets on what technology can do and on what just fixing the infrastructure can do. So what are the sort of the 2 areas that you see happening in health?
Yeah, health is where we've spent the most money. The majority of our work has been there. Part of that is the upstream science, inventing new vaccines, and part of it's been the downstream. Once you have those vaccines, how do you get them out to all the world's children? We're raising the money so that the limited budgets of those countries don't block them from getting even the very latest vaccine. So one for diarrhea called rotavirus. Next 5 years we'll get out to all the kids. One for respiratory disease called pneumococcus. We'll get out to all the kids. And those 2 alone will save over 500,000 lives. And that's why we think we can go from the 1 in 20 kids, 5% who died before the age of 5, now, 15 years from now, get that down to be 1 in 40.
In addition to health, Gates thinks farming will get far more productive for the world's poor.
Well, to get agricultural productivity up, you want many factors working in your favor. You want better seeds. You want farmers to adopt the best seeds. The farmers have got to be a lot more educated because they can often grow 2 crops in a season, and the way they deal with soil health by rotating the crops can make a big difference. They also need a credit system because if they don't have the money to get fertilizer, that alone will cut their productivity very substantially. And so that farmer education system, that's sometimes called the extension system, the R&D to make those better seeds, which is really very underfunded, by managing those things well, we predict that we'll get African productivity up to 1.5 times where it is today. And that will get Africa to the point where even with its population growth, somewhat worse weather, instead of importing food, it will be able to feed itself.
So when you talk about developing better seeds, that to me sounds like you're talking about GMOs without really talking about GMOs. Is that a term that you're avoiding because it's a boogeyman? Even though when people figure out what GMOs are, they're generally okay with it. It seems like we're not talking about actually big ag companies doing GMO research.
Well, GMOs are very well accepted in some countries like the United States and not as well accepted in Europe. The African countries will have a choice of whether to use those tools. And there is quite a bit of improvement still available with conventional breeding. But in this time frame, the GMO-derived seeds will provide far better productivity, better drought tolerance, salinity tolerance. And if the safety is proven, then the African countries will be among the biggest beneficiaries. And so by making sure that their safety review is well funded, so it's all done on a basis, the same as we do for medicines. I mean, after all, medicines, some are very dangerous, and yet, every country says if something goes through a safety review, they're not going to deny themselves the benefit of breakthrough medicine. So I think most of Africa will see this as a way to improve their productivity, but it's a sovereign decision. No one makes that for them.
Right. So can you step in and provide sort of like a quasi-regulatory oversight and say, we've invested in Monsanto, we've invested in Cargill, we've looked at this, and our foundation will provide the vouchsafe for these things, or are you going to leave that up to each of these nations to do alone when they might not have the resources to do it?
Well, we can fund training so that they have scientists who can staff their safety commission. We can make sure that the studies that they're done and done well. We can incent the companies that are making these great seeds for rich countries. We can work with them to make sure that it's at least available, actually at a lower price, because that tiered pricing where poor countries get a better price has worked so well in medicines. That same type of thing we can make sure happens with these crops. But at the end of the day, they get to decide anything about which vaccines, which drugs, which seeds are okay. That's their country. But their expertise is developing. So I feel like they'll make a good choice.
And I want to talk about pricing just real quick. So I have a quote here from the UN Conference on Trade and Development 2013 report, and I'm just going to read it real fast. The perception that there is a supply-side problem is questionable. Hunger and malnutrition are mainly related to the lack of purchasing power and or inability of rural people to be self-sufficient. And so I guess my question is this really about developing more crops, more supply, or is it really about the income inequality in these countries?
Well, food doesn't magically move itself from one place to another. Otherwise, the sinks of rich world homes, all that nice stuff that it's good stuff, clean, doesn't get eaten, it would be there. And we do have population increase where Africa in particular will grow a lot. And then we do have, as people eat more meat, there's an inefficiency that you have to grow more grain to create the equivalent number of calories in meat. So we have to increase world food productivity quite a bit, almost double it by 2050 between all the different factors. And one of the few places where there's acreage that's not being used and that the productivity is way below the world average is in Africa. And so it's wonderful that many of the poorest people in the world are African farmers, getting their productivity up so they can have more nutritious food, more food, and meeting that global demand. Those two things are going to go together. And so it's a huge win-win that as we help them, we help feed the world.
Let me ask it much more directly. Is it better to invest sort of in the supply side, or is it better for you, as a very wealthy man, to just buy people food?
Well, the impact of a more productive seed used by millions of farmers, it multiplies that R&D investment by factors of 1,000. It's like writing a piece of software that millions of people get to use. Would I have been better to go to somebody's typewriter and type up a Word document for them, or instead of using Excel, I'm actually good at multiplication, I could have done the multiplication for them, or should I create Excel and then it can do a lot of multiplications for a lot of people. So there is something that only philanthropy and government can come by and do, and it's far more impactful than doing that as a handout. The scale of government as a whole is gigantic compared to philanthropy. Philanthropy has to pick the risky, diverse things that neither the market nor government are going to do. And R&D, or pilot schemes to improve delivery, those are the kinds of things that philanthropy is unique at driving forward.
Gates' vision for banking and finance is perhaps his most idealistic. He believes mobile payments and microtransactions will allow the world's poor more and better access to financial institutions and credit systems, even if problems like regulation and technology lock-in aren't fully solved.
Part of it is that the fixed cost of ATM machines and bank tellers and all that means that small transactions are money losing in the old system. There's just too much labor, too much paperwork, too much physical activity. In the new digital realm, where we take and build a debit card equivalent that's just your cell phone, as we've seen in a few pioneering countries like Kenya with a system called M-Pesa, or talk about the Bangladesh bKash, it's a newer one, but that's catching on pretty quickly. There, even 50-cent type transactions, you can have an under 2% fee. And so it starts to be economic to bank the very poorest, not with branches or ATMs, but simply with the cell phone. And so now all these benefits of, okay, I'm a farmer, when I sell my crop, help me to set aside enough for next year's seed and fertilizer, or my kid's going to school, help me do the set aside so I won't be surprised when those fee requests come in. That is going to be delivered through that digital infrastructure.
So digital infrastructure is something that you are particularly expert in, and so when I look at that, I think that's great, and the increased liquidity of transactions and assets when you move them to phones instead of cows obviously makes a lot of sense. But the flip side of it is that you're offering a lot of power now to technology vendors who may not be in a market where poor people have enough market power to move off their platform or pick a better rate or do any of the normal things that consumers in an otherwise regular technology marketplace would do. How do you solve that problem where you want the best technology product to win or the most fair to consumers to win, but because the vendors who get there first can lock people in, might just necessarily run away with it?
No, it's a good point. There's a need for a utility type service that lets you move money when you want to pay someone else, pay a store, so that you can pay a store no matter if they use the same bank as you do. You can pay your relative in the rural areas no matter if you use a different bank, or if you want to switch your account from bank 1 to bank 2. And so a lot of our work to get this low-cost digital debit card using the cell phone going is making sure the regulator has set up the right safeguards, and that includes a money transfer system that has very low fees that lets, and insisting that every bank that's licensed connect up and have these reasonable fees. It's kind of like phone number portability is in the mobile space, that you can switch a carrier and not have to change that phone number. And so that's why the foundation's role in working with these regulators and taking lessons from different countries will help get this into the most pro-poor form we can.
So let me ask you, because there's another answer to this question. So you're talking about relying on regulatory infrastructure and banks participating, but there are many, many investors and smart people out there who will tell you that the answer to these questions is Bitcoin. So what do you think about Bitcoin as a solution to these problems?
Well, the effort to make sure your Bitcoin provider isn't going to lose your money and your understanding of the volatility of Bitcoin, I'd hardly say that's ready for poor people to have it go up and down by a factor of 2 and oops, I was at Mount Gox, now that's not good, now I'm at bit whatever. So that basic technology shows that digital can do these things very cheaply, and the fees that have been built up over time won't stand up even for small transactions. Now, making sure that the thing is fraud resistant and money can be refunded, there's somebody you call up if you think you transferred to the wrong account or your account to balance is not what you expect. And so I'm not thinking that the poor should get out there on the cutting edge. Also, governments for most transactions will want attribution. That is, the idea of a system where you can't see, is that drug money? Is it terrorist money? Should that be taxed? You're going to have some tension between the attributed systems like credit card, debit card systems, where there's actually a record of who's engaging, and the purely anonymous ones. But the one I see us getting to critical mass, along with the government and regulatory support we need, is one where it's attributed, where we can see who actually did this transaction.
Gates also thinks education will dramatically improve in developing countries as online learning tools make it easier for students and teachers to connect around the world.
Well, the availability of the world's best teacher who can see where you're confused, set the right pace for you, where all your engagement with that material, your teacher or your parent or your friend can connect up and see where you're stuck and give you some advice. We're not there yet. 15 years ago, we were just sticking cameras in front of people and putting it online and saying, okay, isn't that the solution? Now, people like Khan Academy and hundreds of others have said, okay, the lecture piece is part of it, but interactive problem sets and having your coach see what it is and understanding the nature of what you might be confused about and explaining to you why you should gather this knowledge. And so the view is that over the next 15 years, that type of material will be wildly better than even the best is today, and it will be available through phones and tablets. It won't replace face-to-face, the social context, the relationship with that teacher, but it'll be playing a gigantic role in letting you catch up, move ahead, and overcome whatever limitations your class size has.
So you might be the most famous motivated learner of all time. And one thing that you had that when you talk about this vision that these kids might not have is you were surrounded by open systems by which you could tinker and play. So I think about critical skills 15 years in the future, and I think programming is one of those skills, and building and hacking is one of those skills. And if you're doing it on a phone, even one of Microsoft's phones or Apple's phones, or you're doing it on tablet, to some extent, one of Microsoft's tablets, one of Apple's tablets, these systems are closed. They don't let you tinker and get in there. How do you see, where do you see that next generation of hackers coming from the developed world if they can't have access to sort of the inside?
Well, I'm sure that it doesn't exist as well as it should today, but there should be sandboxes even inside, take the extreme case, iOS, where you can kind of have arbitrary code. So, we should be able to let people play around. I'd have to say that the priority of getting people coding and exposing to code, that's something, I'm a backer of code.org. I think they're doing a good job. A day of coding, Girls That Code, lots of good movement there. Because we're not dealing with the basics of reading and writing in these poor countries, I think, for the next 15 years, most of the energy is going to go into the basics. So I'm enthused about people programming. I think we can enable it, but our agenda is really at the more basic level.
So I think this is really important, and it's something you bring up in your letter. You talk a lot about the systemic inequality in education, particularly in the developed world, particularly for girls. I haven't seen a lot about how you intend to address it. You just acknowledge that it's a problem, and if you add the tools, women with the means and motivation to use them will use them. But how do you really attack the systemic inequality there?
Well, if you look at primary school enrollment, secondary school enrollment 15 years ago versus today, countries are making a lot of progress on this. The idea that parents should not keep the girl in the house, should let her go out. To primary school, that's broadly accepted. Now we need to get there for secondary school. The United States now, business school, medical school, male-female ratios are actually, in some cases, favoring the women. It's still the sciences, particularly the very hard sciences, and particularly as you get up to the PhD level, where we still have this huge gender imbalance. It's a very cultural thing. Each country may have slightly different tactics of how they get the parents' mindset about the investment in both boys and girls are equally valuable, equally important.
Here on The Verge, we'll be hearing more from Bill Gates throughout the month of February as he narrates our series The Big Future, and we write features about his areas of change.